Good evening. This is the second class on in our Reimagining Shemitah series. I know we have a few, as you said, a few new people and a couple of people who aren't here, but we'll be back next week. Last week we covered 30 pages of ground, even in just like 6 or 7 pages, as we discussed. The page numbers are a little off, as you remember. We talked about some of the biblical foundations of Shemitah. And today, what I'm hoping we're going to do is talk about how the rabbis took the experience of the Jewish people, codified it, and we're going to have a clearer sense. We're also going to answer a few of the questions that we didn't quite have full answers to last week. And it's going to be a combination of rabbinic literature and sort of medieval stuff, a lot of Rambam in here. And we're going to get a sense of like what actually is permitted and what's forbidden and how are you supposed to go about this, and a little bit of what's underneath these laws of Shemitah. And then we are going to move forward, sort of skip all the way forward to a conversation which we may not have time to finish today, but which will be about how Jews at the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, and the creation of the State of Israel, and even to today, how did they manage these laws which say that every 7 years you have to stop growing stuff? How do they do that? And it's going to be a little messy. It's going to be a little messy, and it is going to be messy in just another week and a half in Israel, with the way Israelis have come to deal with this. And what I'm hoping is that we're going to be ready by next week to talk about importing some of the ideas of Shemitah into our experience over the coming year. Because ultimately, the reason we're calling it Reimagining Shemitah is that we can't just imagine Shemitah, and we're not going to experience Shemitah here. Because as we said last week, Shemitah doesn't apply outside of the land of Israel. But there's so much good stuff there. And there's a vision, as I said last week, of environmental ideas, economic ideas, that we as a society, I would argue, are in need of, that it would be a shame to sort of take this sort of beautiful complex of ideas and just say, it's just for over there. So that's next week. In the meantime, we're going to go back to rabbinic literature, and I think we'll take a few minutes to have you do a little bit of chavruta, and then we're going to move right into working on some stuff together. So, you can open to page 29, which, as I mentioned, is not going to be 29 pages into your little booklet. Look for the ones with a 3 at the right-hand corner. Okay? And I would ask you to look at page 29. At the top of the page, you have a comment by Rashi, and at the bottom of the page, Rambam. Turn to your neighbor, 2 or 3 people together. Read those. You can take a look at the questions on the right-hand side, and let's see what we have. Okay? All right, we're going to come back together. We're going to look at Rashi, and then look at Rambam. And what is Rashi saying? In a word, hefker. What's this mean? Hefker. Ownerless. Communal acts. Hefker means ownerless. And what's ownerless? How is this going to work? You're not growing anything. You're not sowing. You're not reaping. You're not whatever.
Whatever comes on your field, on its own, comes on your field.
Whatever grows.
And you can get it for your family like everybody else, but everybody else has access to it too.
So you mean I can just like go down the block and go and pick the apples from your trees? Yep. During the Shemitah year.
Yeah, I think
Rashi's a little tighter about that than Maimonides, than Rambam is.
How so?
Well, Rashi says, your hired worker, and those who reside with you. Mm-hmm. So that's everything inside your fence, inside your compound. That's Rashi. Now Rambam says everybody, that it's just everyone, rich and poor, has equal rights
in every place.
I think it says rather all should have equal rights to the produce of the 7th year, and then he kind of I think he just kind of is making like a little
Yeah.
example.
You,
Right, that's
meaning
right.
all of you,
I'm with you.
and all of the hired workers around, not your hired worker, all those people. That is not a class difference, and Rambam makes it more clear anyway. And so it's just open, right? Anyone can go and you can take it, right? How much can you take?
Well,
That's
small
a problem,
amount.
small amount.
A small amount. How do you know?
Rambam, look the last paragraph of Rambam.
Yeah.
One may only bring a small amount of produce into one's home, just as one brings from ownerless property.
Right. Why is that? Why do you think?
Because everybody else owns it.
Because you're not going to hoard it. You have to use what you're going to take what you need to, exactly at that point to leave for other people to take as well.
Right.
But then do you go every day, or can you take a week's worth?
It doesn't say exactly
Can
how
you take
much.
Twice on Friday.
Just enough so you can eat it, right? I mean, after all, it's not. We're talking about a time before refrigeration, right? So there's only so much that you can have without it going bad, and it doesn't say it here. But really, you're not supposed to dispose of Shemitah produce. You're not. It is there. Actually, we're going to see some other stringencies. It's not like you can just sort of chuck it. It's
No
like
leftovers.
it's really special, and you got to eat it.
You can
By the
throw
way,
it, yeah.
especially in a year like this, we're not going to want to waste anything because there's just not that much food around. Okay.
Wow. Okay. That makes
So,
sense.
and we're going to see in a minute that there are other restrictions having to do with the timing of how much you can eat, or that is to say, how long you can keep this in your house. Right? You're gonna see that in just a minute.
So
Okay.
what can you do if you have your garden? Can you still take care of the garden? Can you grow it or just leave it?
You cannot.
Whatever growing.
Whatever grows, grows. And actually, on the next page, the Rambam is going to talk more about this, and it's going to answer a question that was asked last week by Francine about. Remember, Francine asked, "What if the plant reseeds itself? You have a tomato plant, and it grows so nice, and then, as sometimes happens, right?
If you leave the fruit on
If you leave it there, right, so something might grow, and then the next year you got a new tomato plant, and you haven't done anything." And I said, I don't know. Here's the answer. Look what it says. Look at Rambam on page 30. Jeff, why don't you start reading for us? All that grows.
All that grows unsown and uncultivated from the earth in the sabbatical year, whether it grew from seeds that fell into the earth before the sabbatical year, or it grew from roots whose plants were harvested previously, but nevertheless grew again, in both instances such produce is referred to with the term safiach, grasses and vegetables that grew on their own accord in the sabbatical year. These are permitted to be eaten according to scriptural law.
Good news! You can eat that tomato. Read the next paragraph.
According to rabbinic decree, all the svichim are forbidden to be eaten.
Bad news. You can't eat that tomato. So, according to the Torah, you can't eat the tomato or whatever else that grew. Sort of from being sort of itself reseeded, that you didn't have to plant it or etc. But the rabbis say no.
So it's not ownerless. It's not like up for grabs. You just have to leave that tomato.
You have to leave that tomato. You
How-
cannot eat it.
Why?
How did people know?
Well, what about
How do you know that wasn't?
Hold on.
Scripture said yes,
Tomato
but the rabbis-
growing during the Shemitah,
Yeah.
right? Either, right, was planted during the Shemitah, in which case it's forbidden,
Okay. You're right.
or the Rambam will tell us, or we're worried about what? What would you be worried about?
Somebody
that
cheating?
somebody yeah.
That someone cheated. That actually, what are the chances, right? That beautiful tomato came from last year's tomato plant that reseeded itself. So we know that does happen, but in general, the rabbis were concerned, and they were. I think I'm in sympathy with this idea, right? That in a year where there's like this angst a little bit about this, that they might be concerned that people might say, yeah, that's been here all along. It's from last year. No. Right. Yeah. You sort of throw down some seeds as you're on your way in, and all of a sudden there's a plant. But look at how they're going to, the Rambam's going to elaborate on this a little bit more.
Oh, okay. All right.
So just go to the third paragraph, actually. Oh, you know what? Keep reading where you were better.
Because of the transgressors, so that they could not go and sow grain, beans, and garden vegetables in one's field discreetly, and when they grow, partake of them, saying that they are actually svichim. Thus we have learned that the only produce of the Shemitah year of which one may partake are the harvest of fruit trees and vines, as well as wild plants that are not typically sown in a garden, such as rue, amaranth, and the like, since the restriction of leaving the land fallow does not apply to perennial wild produce. With regards to vegetables that most people sow in their gardens and species of grain and beans, by contrast, anything that grows from these species is forbidden according to rabbinic decree.
So the last question on the left-hand side says, do you think this is fair? Do you think this is like a fair and reasonable decree, considering that the Torah didn't explicitly forbid it?
Aren't you going to have a waste of food then?
You might have a waste of food. I guess the answer would be yes, there would be some.
Or you're really, doing like a compost and it's actually feeding the land for the next year. I mean, if you leave it there and it rots into the land, right? I mean, it's...
Right?
Well, there's a difference between it makes sense logically and is it fair?
Okay.
But I have a,
Well, answer whichever question you'd like then,
a
Bob.
question. If you have
It makes sense
non-Jews,
and it's unfair. I mean,
You make it makes sense and it's unfair.
Yeah, right.
How so?
Because it's there. I mean, you should. I don't know if you should, but it would seem, assuming that that you didn't plant the stuff, that you could, and it grew on its own. Like Francine said last week. By the way, you're famous, Francine.
Yes, we're answering your question right now.
thank
you for the response on you.
Then you should be able to lift it up. And it's like mistrusting someone who may not be deceitful. But it makes sense. It makes all kinds of sense because there's a tendency for somebody to hedge on the rules.
Okay, Julie.
I guess the question is, what's the purpose of the Shemitah, right? I mean, we have to go back to that. I think you're right. It could happen that a tomato, well, they didn't have tomatoes back then, but whatever resowed it, itself, and it would be unfair because really no person sowed it, got sowed by itself. But the question
if
is,
that's the case.
if that could happen, right, hypothetically. But the point is, what is really the reason for having that Shemitah year?
So you'd have to go back to some of the sources from last week, right? And underlying it, there are a few different things, right? We talked about how this is a year which is dedicated to God, but it also is a rest for the land. The land deserves it and will get that rest. We talked about this, how built into some of the laws of Torah, or to the Torah itself, is the idea that if we don't let the land rest, God will exile us so that the land can rest. There's also a sense of, and we're going to talk about this a little more, about the idea of, the sort of the
Is it
more
not,
common way that we talk about sabbatical in terms of rest for us as well.
isn't it also, maybe I'm off course, but is it not also sort of like the great equalizer? I mean, isn't that built into the idea of Shemitah? Is that if everyone has access to the same produce or lack of access to the same produce, that somehow socially at least that kind of equalizes, in addition to giving it restoring resting or restoring of the land, it's also like a restoring of that kind of social interaction.
So this goes back to what the Rambam said, that actually was what Rashi was commenting on the last page, right? Rather, all should have equal rights to the produce of the seventh year, your hired worker, and those who reside with you. That is sort of that equalizer, not to mention the economic policies. We'll talk about that a little bit later. This idea of the release of loans, right? Of payment of loans, and how that also comes to equalize things as well. Deborah's been there, yeah.
Nutritionally, it's very thin then, just fruits and random grains. What about meat or fish or?
So
Well, during the sixth year, they produce 3 years worth of food.
If they, okay,
and they
put
store
it aside
for the seventh and then the 8th year.
right, there is. I mean, that is what the Torah says it will happen. But we did already have last week we had talked about some concerns about that, and we also talked about the sense of sharing sort of a communal plan for this sort of thing. Well, and it also sort of makes everyone relate to each other in a similar way, as opposed to the way things normally are, whereas some have a lot, some have not so much, some have really very, very little, and there's no sense of, at least not an obvious sense of, communal evenness, right? There's tzedakah to fix the problems, but it's not like everyone's on the same footing. Yeah,
Did Shemitah have anything to do with meat and fish
Yeah,
and
that's a good
eggs and
question.
chicken?
and milk, I don't think so.
it doesn't say anything here about meat, and I believe it does not.
Okay.
But remember, right? In general, like, I think a lot of us think of like real Jewish food as like fleshik, right? But I just don't think that the access that they had to meat is the way. I mean, look around the world today, right?
What about
People
sheep?
all over the. It's not that there were none. It's the amount. We're talking about the amount. Like that's why a sacrifice was like a big deal.
Oh.
Sacrifice a whole animal. Oh my God, that's a lot of value there. Why are our dietary and why is Western dietary stuff all messed up? At least one answer is because we eat a lot of meat, right? And they didn't have quite the same problems in the past because their diet was different in any case. I don't want to spend too much time on this one text because we have a lot to do today. So if you would hold the rest of your questions for a minute, and we're going to keep going a little bit, and it'll all come back around because we're going to make hopefully have a big package of all these ideas together about the way the rabbis wanted us to think about Shemitah. So, seasonal diet. When can you eat the different fruits? And when do you have to stop eating the different fruits that you got off the trees? The Rambam here will give us the answer to that. We may only partake of the produce of the sabbatical year as long as that species is still found growing in the field. You cannot get bananas in January. In fact, in the Rambam's time, you couldn't get bananas at all, I guess. But you know what I'm saying, right? Right? It's one of the great things about the American supermarket. You can get bananas any time of year. You get mangoes, you get all this different stuff. That is just not the way most of human history has worked. You can only get stuff at certain times of year. So, this is derived from Leviticus 25:7. For the animal and the beast in your land will be all the produce to eat. That doesn't, for the animal and the beast in your land will be all the, that doesn't sound right to me, right? Looks like there's a word missing. This implies that as long as a beast can be eating from this species in the field, one may eat from what he has collected at home. This is like a midrash on that verse. That is to say, if it's still out there and available for the animals, you can eat it too. But once all the apples are off the trees, you can't be eating apples anymore. What if you got a lot of apples in your house, though?
Does it say you can't eat it, or does it say you have to release it to open ownership?
In which case, it will then be eaten and it'll be gone. Same thing.
Yeah.
They're not putting a clock on it exactly like, oh my God, no, 12 o'clock midnight and anything's got to be gone. It's just saying it's seasonal is the key idea here. When there's no longer any of that species for the beast, we already read that, right? When it's obligated to remove that species from his home and make it available to the public. This is the obligation of biur, which applies to the produce of the sabbatical year. What is implied? If a person has dried figs at home, he may partake of them as long as there are figs on the trees in the field. When there are no longer figs in the field, it is forbidden for him to partake of the figs he has at home, and he must instead remove them.
But dry
Where should he put
fruit,
'em?
maybe from previous year.
Maybe what? Oh, from previous year?
You can eat it.
Okay, so good point.
I don't think it makes a difference.
I don't know if it makes a difference actually either.
But then what's the sense of collecting
Yeah.
wheat for 3 years when the wheat's
There's no
finished?
wheat growing,
But
unlike there are figs growing. Figs will grow naturally regardless, right?
but
wheat won't
there
be
is a
growing.
concept of eating wild things. You can eat wild things, and figs can grow also wild. So if it's a wild figs, you can eat. If
Until
it's
the
not-
season is done.
Yes, yes,
Until the season is done.
yes.
And then you move on to whatever else is growing.
This is a
Well, that's
series of restrictions. First you can do a lot of stuff, but Rambam comes and he says, not so fast, and he's applying a set of restrictions.
Why would he want us to stop eating those figs?
Good question, but he evidently wants us to.
He wants us to, maybe because we have too many figs in our house. You went out and took all the figs, and now no one's got any figs.
Instead of leaving them on the trees. It's like you collected too much.
I mean, this is, by the way, a way of limiting also. We asked early on, how much can you take? Presumably only a little bit. How much is a little bit? Well, I'm going to keep some for now, and I'll dry some, and I'll have them, and but you have to put it back out.
So the rabbis were concerned about hoarding and
Seems so.
taking advantage.
It seems so.
Uh,
They also, again, if we're going for a sense of everyone's on the same footing, hoarding is making sure that we're not all on the same footing. It's not just about the guy who's like. It's not. I don't think the Rambam is worried that like someone's going to be really hungry and I'm going to be taking away his figs. I think he is trying to get at the root of this whole idea of Shemitah, which is we're all supposed to be dependent on what's growing from the land and what we benefited from the 6th year's produce. So you can't just go out and like take all the stuff. And if you do, then at a certain point we're going to make you put it out because how many figs can you eat after all? And so. I mean, and again, I'm saying it in a joking way. It's not really how many figs can you eat after all. Actually, well, I can eat quite a lot. I can keep them in my back room all year, and that'll be like a nice little sweet treat for me. And the Rambam is saying no, right? It is connecting you with the seasons in a way that those of us who eat bananas in January are not forced to reckon with.
So, dried fruits, pickled fruits from previous year.
I don't know. He doesn't say here. I'd have to check.
It says
No, about previous years.
Well,
previous years.
in current Israel, you can eat produce from the 6th year and the 7th year, and you cannot eat produce from the 7th year. So means the Orthodox in Israel, they can eat in the 7th year that begin now. Produce from the 6th year they can eat all the time that in the stores, but they cannot put nothing that was produced in the 7th year.
Well, nothing's supposed to be produced.
But this is correct. I don't know what.
Well, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. It's not quite as clear as even in the Orthodox community. It's not quite as clear. We're going to talk about that. What you would see in a supermarket in a few weeks, and what will be available and not available, and how that will be. Okay.
When does the Shemitah year begin?
Rosh Hashanah.
And Rosh Hashanah.
Eat your figs. Another week and a half.
Okay.
On same page, last paragraph, number
Yeah.
6.
Yes.
When a person pickles 3 types of produce in one barrel,
Yes.
if one of these types of produce is no longer available in the field, that type of produce should be removed from the barrel. Just this type.
Yeah, that's what he said.
But that could all be 7th year.
This type.
Right.
So stuff from previous year based on this should be available.
Should be okay.
Yeah, but it says,
no. It says no.
but it says if he has figs at home, he must instead remove them. It doesn't say figs from this year.
So yeah. So let's say again. Let's say, Boris, the figs came from the 6th year, and I had them preserved. Let's say, not pickled, right? But then the figs are all gone from the trees in the 7th year. Can I eat my 6th year figs?
If it's dry.
The group's saying they think probably not.
No,
But I'm not sure, to be honest.
I don't think so.
So in a way, for me, this is almost like an extrapolation of the manna. I mean, like it's based on faith, right? I mean, it's like God's going to provide for me, even though I don't have stuff in my field, and I'm just going to rely on the season and whatever happens, and I'll eat what I can eat. I'm not going to eat more than what I can eat. And, you know what I mean? It's there's a lot of, to me, there's a lot of parallels to that.
I think that's true, and I think the Torah talks about it that way in terms of God is going to give us a bumper crop that 6th year, right? To tide us over through the 7th and even into the 8th, as we said last week, because when the 8th, next Rosh Hashanah, there's not going to be any food that grew because it was the Shemitah year. So you got to wait through the season of the growing season.
So in a way, if you hoard or if you decide to store, it's kind of an affront to your faith in God. It's like, God's not going to provide for me, so I got to do it on my own.
It's also not very nice to your neighbors.
That's not right. Ultimately, yeah.
But a lot of this, I think, because of the nature of it, is we're focusing on the most angst-ridden part of this.
Well,
That's a reality, though.
Which is why we're focusing on it. But I think that to miss the idea of partially what you said earlier, which is to say a leveling out of the society, and the idea that we're all in this together, and the idea that the idea of this debt release, which we're about to talk about, and the idea of some financial changes. Remember, part of what I said last week, and this is, I think, what's sort of inspirational about this, is that if you're living in an agricultural society and you're not in the fields, there's a lot of time to do something else. And I'm not sure exactly what that something else is, but it creates the possibility of community in a way that people who are busy from sun up to sundown in the fields to be together more, to create something more together. I've been thinking about the fact, Jeff said, well, what am I going to be doing? I'm going to be fixing the fence that I didn't have time to fix all year and doing all this other stuff around the farm. And I'm sure that that's also true. But that also presumably allows us to, first of all, it's a healing of other parts. Maybe it's overly technical, right? You're fixing a fence or you're fixing whatever. You're doing other stuff which is permitted. And I'm sure that's what people would do, serious people, because they want to get themselves in the best position for next year. But it's probably not going to take up all your time. There's still going to be that opportunity. You have a whole group of people who are living a different reality for an entire year than they did the last 6. You have to imagine there's potential there for something as individuals and in community. It's not, I guess what I'm trying to say is, hopefully it's not all angst. Not to say there isn't any. Bob?
I wonder what the animals ate.
What was on the trees?
Like animals, like horses aren't going to eat figs.
If there's nothing else around there. No, I'm just kidding.
It's grown to 6
No.
years.
In fact, one of our texts coming up, hold on one second. Did we skip it?
Most of the animals grazed.
Great.
Yeah. It's supposed to be for... the food is supposed to be used for food, right? For people and for animals, what's on the trees, and whatever is left over from last year's harvest as well for the animals. Just to look at it briefly on page 35, it says you're not supposed to use food products for non-food stuff. So you shouldn't use it for a compress or a bandage or whatever. And I was thinking that this is actually particularly difficult, I think, for a society which has learned, maybe you would say this is, well, I guess it depends on who I'm talking to, I guess. For those who believe that ancient civilizations really understood medicine so well, much better than modern medicine, and they used all this natural stuff to make all the great medicines that we don't have anymore, okay. But if you believe that we actually have found a way to also harness a lot of nature that the ancient people weren't able to, then we have got problems, right? A lot of this stuff comes from plants. Here, in this case, it's saying, you can't use that stuff for medicine or for... I don't know what else we use it for.
Health spas are in trouble. No more cucumber wraps.
No more cucumber wraps. That's right. It's a good but funny
Bananas
example.
cure warts.
Bananas cure warts. You got to eat the bananas that they didn't exist in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, and you got to eat what's food. You got to eat the food, right? Not use it for other things. Let's move on because I want to take a look at the idea of this debt release, page 42. This is a really interesting idea, a really important idea about Shemitah, but one which 2,000 years ago sort of went by the wayside in an interesting way, but it's important to look at and the underlying idea. So, this is also the Rambam. Larry, you want to read for us there? It's a positive commandment?
Sure. It's a positive commandment. Nullify alone in a sabbatical year. All those who bear debt must release their hold.
Right. So if you are you've made a loan, and at the end of the 7th year you have to release it. The person doesn't have to pay back anymore. Okay, that's what the Torah says. Go on.
The sabbatical year does not nullify debts until its conclusion. This is derived as follows. Deuteronomy 15:1-2 states, "At the end of 7 years you shall effect a remission. Therefore, if one lent money to a colleague in the sabbatical year itself, he may demand payment of his debt for the entire year. When the sun sets on the night of Rosh Hashanah on the 8th year, the debt is nullified."
I hope to give a little bit of an answer to Bob's question from last week. Why the end of the Shemitah year as opposed to the beginning? I have some answers, but I want to not go there just yet. Larry, you have a question? At the end of the 7th year, you have to release the loan, release the debt.
So the last year, the 7th year, it's nullified?
At the end.
Yeah. Rosh Hashanah,
At the end.
beginning of the 5th year,
Money
basically.
comes you, say Pesach.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it make sense?
Pesach which year?
Rosh Hashanah. Forget it, huh?
Which depends which year. Right, it's of the 7th year?
Is on the 6th year, okay, I borrowed money from you, Pesach, that's, okay?
On the 7th
In
year.
April.
Even the 7th year, because it's not due, it's not going to be released until the end of the 7th year. Let's say this Pesach the 7th year, you borrow money, and if you don't pay it back by Rosh Hashanah, gone.
Okay.
How likely will I be to lend you that money? The Torah says so explicitly that I should not refrain from giving you that loan. It says that because I would naturally want to refrain from giving you that loan. But I should open my hand, and I should do that, and I should trust in God. And the rabbis will say basically that God will make sure to do good by those who make those loans. We're going to see what the story is with those people.
I learned in a different class. I don't know if I should bring it.
You shouldn't yet. Give me a minute. We're going to go a little further.
Well, then couldn't you just set up loans and payments to be paid back in 6 or 7 year cycles?
You could make sure that the loan is paid. And what happens if I don't pay it though?
Right, but if somebody's been paying you for 6 years, hopefully regularly,
Right.
your
So-
losses would be less.
Right. And I think it's important to look. I look at the next page because the Rambam has. I never learned this text before, and I brought it actually to a meeting earlier today. I just thought it was a really interesting text about, what is this loan forgiveness really all about, and what are we trying to accomplish here? And I think in this text he adds to what he just said. So, Francine, you want to read for us there?
Sure. Whenever anyone returns to debt, despite the fact that the sabbatical year has passed, the spirits of our sages are gratified because of him. When returning a loan, the debtor should not tell the creditor, I'm giving this to you as a payment of my debt. Instead, he should tell him, this money is mine, and I'm giving it to you as a present.
Keep going.
Okay? If a debtor.
Debtor. You can ignore the B.
Okay. Returned the debt, but did not make the above statement, the lender should turn the conversation to the point where the debtor says, this money is mine, and I am giving it to you as a present. If
Right.
the debtor does not make such statements, the creditor should not accept it from him.
So Rambam knows what the law is. At the end of that 7th year, it gets released. And what is he saying? What really should happen, what would really be the best way, would actually be for the person to pay back that loan. Except not.
Right.
Because the law says you don't have to pay back that loan. And so what you have is the person who needed this loan, who had to go and ask for a loan, now is in the position of saying, I want to give you a gift. It may look just about as much as you lent me a little while ago, but it's just a gift. And if he says, no, I'm paying you back, the lender can't even receive it.
Well, that's a lot like bankruptcy today. If somebody declares bankruptcy, if somebody has a debt to my practice, let's say, and they declare bankruptcy, and then they want to come back as patients, and they want to pay me, I can't legally accept
The previous stuff?
They've got to completely wash that out. Nobody's ever offered to give me a gift, but it's but it's an
Right.
interesting thing.
Never
Legally, you can't accept it.
I thought you were about to tell me about how someone came and they wanted to pay all that back.
It's an interesting thing.
Yeah. Now, I think it's really, I just think it's, again, it gets closer to the heart of what we're talking about. Mostly we've been talking about someone feeling like there's not enough food, and I'm worried about this, and worried about people sort of cheating a little bit. Here, the borrower is not cheating. The law says he doesn't have to pay it back. And the Rambam is creating this aspirational idea that this person who wasn't looking to get, I think part of the mindset is, well, how do I can get this? I can figure this out so that I can borrow and then not have to pay back. And the Rambam is saying, that's not the guy we're talking about. We're talking about a guy who didn't have money. And he would have paid back, but he didn't pay back, and so it gets forgiven. A poor guy. And then he realizes, now I've got the money. Well, how do I make this right? I want to make this sort of Right. You can't pay it back, the Rambam says, because that is not the way it works. Instead, do this. And I think, wow. I mean, it would be great if your patients came back and said, I'd like to give you a gift. Yeah.
In the 8th year, they can borrow the money again.
If you want to make that loan, yes, they can. Remember, we talked about this a little bit last week. These people who are borrowing, a lot of them are farmers who are borrowing to get the seed, and then at the end of the year they can pay back.
Also, the concept, I assume, if you are not paying back your debt, you live in a small community. How easy will it be for the next time that you ask money if you don't pay?
I'm sure that there is that pressure. Again, we have to. Part of it is, who are we imagining? Right? Are we imagining a guy who took advantage of the system to not pay back, or are we looking at a guy who had a bad crop? If we're looking at a guy who had a bad crop, who we know because he's from our community, that's why I lent him the money to begin with, then when he comes back to me, like I figure, when he gets the money, he'll probably want to pay me back. Okay. Shaul was going to tell us about the Prus Bowl.
Well, I don't know if it's the Prus Bowl. I learned in some other place that a way to deal with this, because there was a period, it was early, that people began not to lend money. So they create the concept of the Beit Din, that you sell, okay.
The Prus Bowl.
Okay.
As I said, you wanted to tell us about the Prus Bowl. Trust me, I knew you did.
Okay, so the people figured out.
Let's read it inside here.
Okay.
We'll read it. When Hillel the elder, page 44. When Hillel the elder saw that the people would refrain from lending to each other.
Is that our Hillel that we know?
No, it's in the 100 or 0. It's very. No,
Yeah.
It's not.
Same Hillel.
No, it's in 100 after the common area. I think so. It's not the same Hillel. I'm almost sure, but I'm not sure.
Hillel lived before Karban.
I think it's the same Hillel. I'm pretty sure. I'll check right afterwards.
Okay.
He saw that the people would refrain from lending to each other and thus violated the words of the Torah, which said, "Lest there be a wicked thought in your heart to cease from lending because of fear that the debts would be released." He ordained a Prus Bowl, literally a legal amendment, so that debts would not be nullified and people would still lend to each other. This represents the body of a Prus Bowl. I am notifying you, so-and-so and so-and-so, that is, the two judges of the court, that I reserve the right to collect all the debts owed to me at any time I desire. The judges or the witnesses should sign below. A Prus Bowl may be composed only when the borrower possesses land. It's not so critical for us right now. Okay, so this, of course, completely turns the idea of the forgiveness of debts right on its head. And I will tell you that I was once sitting in the median on Broadway in New York, and I'm just sitting there, I was waiting for Robin, and a guy walks up to me and engages me in conversation, which already in New York is a little weird for that to happen. And he starts talking to me about Torah, and he's like, how could Hillel do this? By which he meant, you Jews got it all wrong, right? Because you follow the rabbis who are doing the opposite of what the Torah tells you to. Which, I just said he actually is doing the opposite, but we are rabbinic Jews, and we understand why Hillel did it, and this is our tradition. But it's clear that he's turning it on its head. What's his excuse? What's his reasoning for it?
People weren't loaning at all.
Encourage people to lend.
Ultimately, the point of this, the whole system of being able to loan money, remember, at no interest when it's being loaned to other Jews, right, was for the sake of those in the community because they needed the money in order to be able to grow their crops and live. And now they weren't lending because of the Shemitah. So Hillel, for the sake of the larger goal, said, we should better to have this and allow people to lend, right, even though in many, it really sort of wipes out this idea of forgiving loans. And that beautiful idea that the Rambam had too, right? But it was necessary at the time, and that is what we ended up following.
What language is Prus Bowl?
I imagine it is Aramaic, but I've never really. I'd have to look. I'd have to check. It's a good question. So, we have the agricultural, we have a bit of the financial, right? And you have a few other texts which will give you some of the Well, for you to consider maybe on the next page and then the page after that. But I want to sort of push us forward into a time when this became really a very tachlis, practical issue for the Jewish community. But to do that, I want to just stay in the ancient period for a second to basically put a question out there that the rabbis examined. Were the laws, what was the status of the laws of Shemitah at different periods in Jewish history? In particular, right before the destruction of the Second Temple and after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Quick question: When did it start, and what was the what's the cycle? How come the cycle started when it started? Do you know?
We'll talk about that later.
Okay, so
And
that's
I
come
have
back
an
to that.
additional question
Yes.
is, if we have the 49 year and the 50 year is 2 years, then that the land rests, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So every
Yes.
50 years you have 2 years.
Yeah,
49 for the
Right.
and
Actually,
one
it's 30, right? Because it's
on the Jubilee.
yeah,
What's that? We have the 49th and the 50th year that it's
yeah.
but
And
then
then-
you have to grow the 50th.
correct,
Yeah.
right? The
So it's
Torah
actually
itself
3 years.
recognized, and the rabbis recognized the enormous challenge of like storing up all that food in order to survive
By
over
the
that period of
51st year,
time.
you'll have nothing. You have
But I
no
got
idea.
bigger problems for you because we're talking about a nation of 7 million people today, and what do you do with these laws? With a country that hold on, that was a rhetorical question for the
Country's
moment.
mostly secular?
We're going to come back to it. We're going to come back. What is the status of these laws? There are 3 options. It could be that the laws are still have the status of being Torah laws. That is to say, as the highest level, let's say, we have to follow them as strictly as possible. Or they could be seen as derabanan, they could be seen as rabbinic law, which is a step down. And there are others who said it's really midat chasidim, which is sort of a piety, less than legal, but it's a good thing to do, and it may be an important thing to do. And there are rabbis from the time of the Talmud which disagree about the status. There are rabbis in the Middle Ages who disagree about the status, and there are rabbis today who disagree about that status. And the ramifications are important because depending on how you feel about the status of these laws, you will or will not permit certain activities to happen during the Shemitah year. Okay? And so we want to talk about that a little bit because those ramifications are felt right in the marketplace. One second. Hold on one second.
But the Shemitah year is only Israel.
Only Israel. And that's another issue.
How about this? Only Israel during a Jewish commonwealth, or only Israel during like any time?
Anytime.
Anytime. In the 19th century, when Jews started really settling there a bit, there was a big hoo-ha about how we were going to observe the Shemitah. And they had to ask the question. But, it's not just the land. Certainly, Shemitah doesn't apply to the state of Israel, because the state of Israel isn't a concept that the rabbis or the Bible takes into account. It's the land of Israel. The question is, what are the boundaries of the land of Israel? So I'm going to tell you that, according to most of the authorities, the Upper Galilee, Ashkelon, most of the Negev, and the Arava, also in the south, are not part of the land of Israel. Not in a technical sense. And therefore, most would argue that anything grown in those areas
It's okay.
is perfectly permissible. How about one more? If you grow stuff above the ground, which we can do now,
Land of Israel.
Oh,
Hydroponics.
Like hydroponics and
is not in the land of
it's
Israel.
not the land of Israel.
All these
Oh my
loopholes
God.
these Jews come up with.
So,
Like an A-rough,
but you also,
Shabbos elevators.
but you also, well, so we're going to be talking about, right, so now we're talking about, are we, I'll just sort of extrapolate from these comments, right? Are we gaming the system, right? So, we could argue that. You could argue that. But part of the issue is, as a halachist who is asked this question, what is permissible and what isn't permissible, you look at the sources that you have. And generally speaking, rabbis over the years have looked, they are sympathetic to the money of the Jewish people. And I say that, I didn't just come up with that term. Rabbis make decisions based on the real consequences to real people. And so, they're not gaming the system. The Bible and the Talmud will tell us what are the boundaries. No, we're going to say, no, now the state of Israel, we should expand them, and so therefore you can't grow in these areas that actually you would be permitted to grow? Well, that doesn't make sense. So that is permissible. Land of Israel means the land of Israel. So it's above the ground. I know, it seems far-fetched, but not a problem. But there are still issues, because that doesn't matter how many beds you're going to put up, it's not going to be enough to support the entire country. And, as you know, the agricultural, not just today, but the agricultural output of the land of Israel, the settlements, etc., even in the early part of the 20th century, really started to grow. They were able to, and today, Israel is a very big exporter. So the question is, early on, Rav Kook, who was the chief rabbi of Palestine before the state of Israel came to be, he was a real central figure in trying to figure out what are we supposed to do. And he wrote a book called Shabbat Haaretz, which is the resting of the land. And I think I mentioned last week, they made a new translation of the introduction, which is very much like Rav Kook, who was a mystic, and it's very flowery, etc. But the heart of the book is a halachic defense of one particular solution to the Shemitah. Okay? And it's called the Heter Mechira. Okay? The Heter Mechira, Heter means it's permitted, the permission to Mechira, to sell. Right? That's not grammatically the right way, but it's the selling permission. What are we permitted to sell? Well, permitted to sell the land of Israel to non-Jews.
It's like Pesach.
It's like the way we sell chametz in a certain sense. That's why, as you were saying these things, if the land is sold to a non-Jew and a non-Jew works the land, then what is produced can be consumed, at least according to those who believe in the Heter Mechira. Some say the Heter Mechira is not a valid option. The land must lie fallow. And they don't believe in that. And then there are others, and we're going to take a look at Rabbi David Golinkin, who's one of my teachers, and president of the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem, who argues that there's a very good reason to consider Shemitah not rabbinic and not biblical and not rabbinic, but actually midat chasidut, and therefore it's at the lowest level. And I'm going to show you a few sources which will give you a sense of why he believes that. Go ahead.
Just to comment on this, as far as I know, in old Russia, before communists screwed everything, it was required for farmers as a good practice to make a schedule on a rotation to leave some fields once in every year, not to grow any crops.
Crop rotation is a standard practice in the agricultural world.
This idea that not to exhaust the land.
Right, and when I say standard, doesn't really mean that everyone's doing it. It means that everyone knows that they should do it.
If you care,
yes.
If you care about it.
Correct.
But
that is not what the Shemitah is. That is to say, it will achieve that, but everyone at the same time.
That goes back to my question: how did this cycle start, and how was it related to?
There's a difference of opinion about exactly how we should judge when the Shemitah is. I believe we follow the Rambam, who actually said it starts at a certain. He figured it out for us, and that is the standard way of following the Shemitah. But there are disagreements, and Rabbi Golinkin actually refers to the fact that it is disputed, and we're not exactly sure of exactly when the Shemitah year really falls, is one more reason why we can be lenient about it. That is to say, if we knew that if we are absolutely sure that the Shemitah is right on this year, well then it makes it all the more reason to do it at that time. But since we're not quite sure, and we could be growing all of our crops on what is actually the Shemitah year, so there's a certain, we won't be able to figure it out exactly. But in any case, that is not his main argument. His main argument is that, I'm going to show it to you actually.
While you're doing it, what are some other examples of Midat Hasidim that we might be familiar with?
Other examples. Here, why don't you take one of these and pass them down?
Well, how about the laws of death and mourning?
There's a difference between minhag. Like, so I would say that most of the, if you think about the laws of mourning are really under the category of minhag as opposed to halacha. Eventually they became followed as if they're halacha. But the Torah gives us so little guidance in terms of them. So that's why they're mostly minhag. Midat Chasidut. I'm going to have to think about it. So,
feel for it.
yeah. So, I wanted to give you just I wanted to give you a couple of explanations, but I think I only gave you really one specific one at the top. Just within a Zionist era, right? The last 140 years, maybe. Why it's particularly problematic in many people's eyes to use the Heter Mechira. Rav Kook, who was a religious Zionist, was the one who was arguing that we can do this, right? We can sell the land, and therefore we're going to be able to survive. He was trying to solve a problem so that we'd actually be able to eat. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people look at him very favorably because of that. But there were many who felt like it's a very non-Zionist sort of thing to do for a Zionist. Well, he wasn't so worried. I mean, I don't think that most people are. I don't think people were worried that all of a sudden they were actually going to sell the land away permanently.
No,
I understand what you're saying.
Going to say, no, we're not selling it back to you.
Right. No, but there is remember, what is the idea underlying this Zionism? The idea is that we're all going to gather together and create a society together and be able to support ourselves and not have to be concerned about relying on others. By the way, what's another way of getting enough food? Nowadays, you couldn't. We talked about it last week. Like, how do we get the food? Right,
buy from other countries.
You could buy it from other countries. Yeah, so, what is the point? One might argue of getting all together, creating the agricultural sector, which is so powerful that 40% of its produce is actually exported, just so that we can be completely reliant on another country for what we eat. So, Rabbi Berkovitz. He puts it in a particular way. Deborah, why don't you read that at the top of that page?
To refrain from tilling the land and to maintain the viability of one's economy through financial support, mainly from non-Shemitah observing diaspora Jewry, it is a confession that, in present conditions, the Shemitah law is not workable. Surely it could not have been the intention of the divine lawgiver that the majority of the Jewish people should live in dispersion, and that the Sabbath of the land be observed through their charitable generosity.
Right. And to show you the counterpoint to that, go to the last page you have. I was so disappointed. I should have taken a picture at Siemens today, but in fact I had to call them and ask them to give me something off a poster which was there, and it is related to this project.
Dear friend, in advance of the coming Shemitah year 5775, the Ahavas Olam Weingarten Torah Center is pleased to present a unique opportunity for the benefit of both Torah Center participants and the greater Jewish community. Baruch Hashem, the Torah Center is able to make available for sale a cultivated parcel of land in Eretz Yisrael in the Yishuv of Talmon for the duration of Shemitah. With a $150 donation to the Torah Center, you can purchase a designated 18-inch by 18-inch plot of that land.
Okay, that's good enough for now. Okay, so what is going to happen on that land over the course of the year? Nothing. How are those people going to survive? By the money that they collect, at least partially, the money that they collect through this project. Now, I mean, there's nothing that says, right, that we, there's nothing. I can't think of anything that says this is wrong from a halachic perspective. You could argue there's something very right from a halachic perspective. But for those of us who are Zionists, there is a certain troubling nature to this if what it means is shutting down this sector of the economy in the land that we feel like, not just a land, but a country that we want to be self-sufficient. And not surprisingly, I'm sure to you, there's a tremendous amount of politics going on with this. So I saw an email from a colleague of mine who was talking about a wine festival that he went to of Israeli wines, and he was asking them what they do for all these producers. What do they do during the Shemitah? Well, the ones he was talking to, many of them who are secular, are closing down. Why are they closing down? Because the sense is, at least, and this is, not only will no one buy from them next year if they don't close down, but who knows, one might argue, who knows that they won't mix with the 57-75 harvest with the 57-76 and 77-78, and so they will find that they will not have customers for the years afterwards. And we haven't even gotten to what you're going to see in the supermarket when you go in a few weeks.
I thought Israel was more than 50% secular at this point.
Indeed, it is.
So
it has to be certificate of kashrut to any wine, correct?
Well,
And
if you
who-
follow kashrut,
well,
if you
but
want, and they want that certificate, and so those certifying bodies put pressure to make sure that people are closed up for the year.
The VOD exists.
It's not.
This
You don't
is
get certificate
tangential,
kashrut. You take out 20%, 20% of the population won't buy your wine.
Right.
What about
Politics.
leket? Is that still observed? I mean, can a
What'd
poor
you-
person go into a kibbutz or anywhere and find a corner that he can get, or what?
There is an organization called Leket. I don't know that the practice of Leket exists in any way today, to be honest. I get part of your question would be, well, is it operational? Like, should it be? And then the second question is it actually happening? I don't.
Kind of like, I mean, the reason I say you could look at it like, well, like hydroponics. Well, we don't have to do leket because we have mazon and we have ways of feeding people that, But if you go by what's in the Torah,
Yes. I think it's more. I think it's more of a practical. There's a more practical reason, which is, right. There are systems set up within the Israeli society and our society as well for distribution, support of the poor that don't rely on these, peah and leket and shichacha, these three agricultural, the corner of the field and the gleanings and what's fallen like from trees and things like that. What's left on the branches after you've harvested. So I don't think it exists.
But my point is, most of the wine, going back to the wine, a lot of the wines are from Golan. That is for sure not the land of Israel, the Golan. Correct? Wine confused there.
That's right. That's right.
So, but still they don't produce. Again, for the same political issue. I don't think they are.
I'm not sure if in the Golan, I'm not sure if that's true or not, to be honest.
I think they are not producing.
So, hold on one second. Okay. So, we're sort of running out of time tonight, but Heter Mechira. Hang on one second. I wanted to tell you about one other solution, that halachic solution to this issue of, what about, are there other ways of growing and being able to distribute it? But it's also a very challenging one. It's called Otzar Beit Din. Let me just read to you this a little bit. The Otzar Beit Din is a framework set up by a rabbinical court to allow distribution of Shemitah produce. The Shemitah produce distributed is sanctified with Kedushat Shvi'it and cannot be sold, exported, or destroyed. Remember we said you can't destroy any of this, right? The growers and distributors are agents of the Beit Din, of the court, and act on its behalf. The Beit Din pays them a salary for their work. The consumer pays to cover these costs and not for the produce itself.
Read that one again.
Yeah, read that again.
The people who are growing the produce get paid, right? And the consumer pays, but to cover the cost of the Beit Din, not to pay for the food.
Because the
But there is an
Beit Din paying
exchange.
the growers.
Because the Beit Din is paying the growers. It's a different way around.
Yeah, they're good.
Many consider Otzar Beit Din as the preferred solution for the Shemitah year. Not only does it provide a means of income for the farmers, it also allows the public to fulfill the mitzvah of eating Shemitah produce. Nevertheless, this option does have certain disadvantages, which are difficult to overcome. It's impractical to expect hotels, restaurants, and other food industries in a modern society to fully comply with the restrictions of Kedushat Shvi'it, right? That is to say, you're not selling it. Then what that is to say, if you buy it and if you get this from through Otzar Beit Din and you bring it home and you make your soup, good. But when the restaurant buys it,
They're selling it to someone.
what are they going to do with all? They're not eating it all themselves. All the people who work there, they have to give it to the people who are in the hotel. But they're going to be paying for it, and you can't pay for it.
Maybe they can just gift it.
They could just rent the chair in the restaurant.
Right. There you go. So, Rabbi Golinkin, hold on one second. Let me take a look at this here. Oh, I should say, you should look at the Haaretz article as well. This is from earlier this year. But the second to last page, Israel allots $28.8 million to farmers for upcoming Shemitah year. Part of the budget. For the people who are going to let their land lie fallow, money from the budget goes to pay for that.
Is this the second Shemitah cycle in Israel? It's got to be.
What do you mean the second?
No, 7 years.
The second Jubilee, you mean like
Gosh.
the 50 years? And
You're thinking Jubilee.
Yeah, okay, never mind.
yeah. So we need to finish up. Here, so let me just say this. If you went to the Shuk in October, what you'd find is there would be signs. You know, we ignore the Shemitah. No, probably not that sign. This is Otzar Beit Din, this is Heter Mechira, and different communities will follow different things. And by the way, what happened the last cycle, just to show you again the challenge of this, is that the Rabbanut, the official rabbinate of Israel, authorized the Heter Mechira, the selling of land, but then said particular rabbis from different cities could decide whether or not they were going to accept it. Then that caused a very big uproar and went all the way to the Supreme Court of Israel, which said that the chief rabbinate can't give with one hand and take away with the other. And that if they said the Heter Mechira is okay, then it has to just be okay, and they have to, all the Rabbanut rabbis have to go along with that. But individuals can choose different methods that they are acceptable.
You said
Right.
only hit parts of Israel.
Only parts.
So if it can't be grown in the southern part, but it can be grown in the northern part, or whatever.
Well, some in the far north and in the far south, it can be grown.
Okay, and then can these other people buy it
Yeah, anybody.
Yes.
and eat it? So
Yes.
it
But
doesn't.
But it's not enough.
we're talking about a lot of people, though. And some of that stuff that's grown in the land of Israel is meant for export. You're not allowed to export, according to the Shemitah, you can't export stuff. Right? It has to be eaten in the land, remember? That's part of the Kedusha, the holiness of this produce. Right? Can't be destroyed again, right? So there are all these complications. I recognize we rushed through. I knew we had a lot of sources to cover today. Here's what I wanted us to do. I wanted us to get to the end of this session, which we are now at the end of this session. You should take a look at what Rabbi Golinkin says on the sheets I gave you today. He's also in the other booklet that I gave you last week. We look at what the Bible says and what the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud say. And we looked at a few sources about how it was observed or not observed. And we looked at how modern Israel is sort of dealing with this. What I'd like to do next week, I'm going to give you a new packet. What we're going to be looking at are concepts from the ideas of Shemitah and how they can be applied today for us. That is to say, what are the agricultural and economic ideas that are inherent in the Shemitah, which, even though we are not obligated for Shemitah, we might be wise to learn from our tradition about how our society here in the United States, whether it's the Jewish part of it or the general part, how we might be able to impact, how these laws might impact us or our communities in really positive ways. So we'll be moving away in some ways from diving directly into these sources and using some of them to springboard off into how this could affect us. Thank you so much.
How did a man just come to talk to you on Broadway about this? Total